Hi, it's Rev Dan, Methodist minister at Bognor Regis, Felpham and Westergate. We're in week 2 of our Bible month journey as we explore the biblical story of Ruth. Last week we thought about Naomi, Orpah and Ruth, who were living in the midst of loss, of grief and the many questions they had about how they would find survival. 3 widows, vulnerable and seeking hope. This week we look at chapter 2 and I want us to focus on how Ruth takes action. Taking action to help her and Naomi to survive, and in doing so, how they find new sources of hope beginning to emerge. If you've watched the film Titanic, you might remember the scene where Jack is handcuffed to the frame of the ship with rising water all around him. The music is building, the water is rising, and as hard as Jack tries, he cannot free himself from the handcuffs that hold him. All hope appears to be lost, but Rose appears. And despite the risk to her own survival, as well as the survival of Jack, she will not give up. Axe in hand, she aims, strikes, and they are free. The danger is not over, but there is hope. They can now seek safety. Ruth 2 opens with Ruth and Naomi without anyone to provide for them. So Ruth decides she must act. With Naomi's permission, she heads out to glean in the fields, to gather the leftover grain from the harvest. And just by chance, just like in any good soap opera where the newcomer turns out to be related to somebody else, Ruth ends up gathering grain in a field owned by Boaz. Boaz, a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. What are the chances? Now we need to remember that Ruth was a Moabite in an Israelite world. She was an outsider, a foreigner, a minority. She was vulnerable in so many ways. She had little status in the community, except perhaps that she achieved through the fact she had a relationship with Naomi. She had little right to be out gathering grain in the field, so she hangs behind the others, ensuring she takes nothing that others would have had the right and privilege to take. Ruth may have taken action to seek survival, but she refrains from pushing the cultural boundary limits too far. But Boaz, on learning Ruth is with Naomi, goes to Ruth and tells her, "Go nowhere else. You can gather in my fields. And don't hang back. You can keep close to the others and my men will leave you alone." i.e., they will not take advantage of your vulnerability. They will not molest you or rape you. Let's not beat around the bush here. This is the reality of just some of the vulnerabilities Ruth would have been facing. Yet despite the vulnerabilities, she steps out for survival, and Boaz welcomes her. And not only that, he tells her to drink from the water that is there for his staff. Not only does Boaz provide, he offers hospitality beyond expectation. We live in a time where our vulnerability is being changed or has been intensified. We also live in a time when light is being shone on the systemic and institutional vulnerabilities that societies force on minorities, including black and minority ethnic people. The vulnerability we see Ruth facing and Boaz's response might offer us a challenge in how we approach issues of difference, be it race or ethnicity, or opinions and preferences. In this episode of the story, we can see how God begins to provide not only the means of survival, but hope and home for Ruth and Naomi. God puts Boaz in the right place at the right time to use his power and privilege, and working through Ruth's own determination brings provision for their future. Ruth seeks survival, and Boaz sees Ruth. Not Ruth the Moabite, but Ruth the human being. And Boaz makes space not simply for her survival, but gives her some sense of equality with his staff, his people. We might say he invites her to be part of the community, to begin to find a home. And in doing so, Ruth's survival seeks and finds hope. One of the ways this chapter might speak to us today is to challenge us to recognise the potential of the power of God and the power of God's Spirit in us. As we see in Ruth's character, we have power to seek hope. God's Spirit in us calls us to challenge cultural boundaries, to stand up against those things that oppress us and threaten our survival and identity as human beings. And we see in the character of Boaz that we possess power and privilege ourselves, and indeed responsibility as God's people, filled with God's Spirit, to contribute towards the survival and the seeking of hope and home of our fellow human beings. So I encourage you to reflect this week. How may God's Spirit be challenging you to use your power and your privilege for yourself, for others, and ultimately for God? God bless you all today with the power and hope of God's Spirit that is already placed within you.